Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the fourth part of our new webinar series in partnership with the Montana Natural History Center and the University of Montana, The Age of the Coronapocene. I'm Jennifer Robinson, Education Director for the Montana Natural History Center and host of this webinar series. Our co-host today again will be Drew LaPier, the Montana Natural History Center Museum Programs Coordinator. She'll be working in the background and available to answer questions and address comments using the chat box. Please let her know if you have any technical difficulties or questions during the webinar. This webinar again will be supported by closed caption capabilities. The wonderful Caroline Habish will be working in the background to provide text for our speech if you need assistance in following along with the program. Please click on the link in the chat box. We will also provide this link for Facebook Live as we're streaming this there as well. This will open up a separate window where you will be able to read what is being said on screen as we are speaking. Please note that the view cap for closed caption is only 50 individuals. Please only use this assistance if you need it, so we have enough space for all who require closed caption assistance. Throughout the webinar, we will repost this link into the chat box and onto Facebook Live for those who join us late. Back with us today are members of our expert panel of scientists and educators from the University of Montana, and they're ready and excited to start more discussions about the science behind the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. As a reminder, our panel are not medical doctors and will not attempt to try or diagnose symptoms in this program. Later in the program, the audience will have an opportunity to ask our panel questions about the virus and living with COVID-19, but note that we will not be taking questions seeking medical advice. Please seek medical help if you have questions or concerns about your own health. Back with us today, we have Associate Professor Dr. Rosalyn LaPier. Rosalyn works in the Environmental Studies Department at the University of Montana and is an award-winning Indigenous writer, ethnobotanist, and environmental activist with a BA in physics and a PhD in environmental history. She works to strengthen traditional ecological knowledge and revitalize Indigenous languages within Indigenous communities. Dr. LaPier is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet Tribe of Montana and Métis. Today's discussion will focus on Dr. LaPier's presentation of fighting the current infodemic and addressing the spread of misinformation circulating through media and our social networks. Also presenting today is Professor Erick Greene, who will be transitioning us full circle into the relationship between how viruses work and how it is crucial to filter out facts from misinformation regarding COVID-19. During the question and answer portion of the webinar, we will be joined again by Assistant Professor Angela Lewis today. Today's webinar will focus on misinformation and common myths surrounding the infodemic of COVID-19 to include, first, treatments, preventions, cures, second, deniers of the virus, and third, COVID-19's origins. Dr. LaPier will start us off, and then we'll turn it over to Professor Greene before transitioning to a question and answer session. During the Q&A, you will be able to ask the panelists questions and have them answered live. To ask questions, you can either use the chat box, the Q&A feature through Zoom, or you can ask questions through the Facebook Live chat function. Let's go ahead and try using the chat box feature now. Go ahead and type into the chat box where you are tuning in from. Great, we've got folks tuning in from Missoula, Anaconda, Ovando, Montana. Awesome. Let's see what folks are saying about where they're coming in from Facebook here. Great. Lots more folks from Missoula. Wonderful. Okay, if you have any technical difficulties during the recording or during the webinar, you can also type in your concerns into the chat box and our co-host Drew will be able to answer those for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in and get started. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rosalyn LaPier. Can you start us off and tell us more about this infodemic we're fighting?
So thank you everybody for joining us today from across Montana and the Rocky Mountain West. So I want to start us off with a quote from Sylvie Brion, who works for the World Health Organization. And in early February, she noted that we know that every outbreak will be accompanied by a kind of tsunami of misinformation. But also within this, with tsunami of information, but also within this information, you always have misinformation, rumors, etc. We know that even in the Middle Ages, there was this phenomenon. But the difference now with social media is that this phenomenon is amplified. It goes farther and faster, like the viruses that travel with people and go faster and further. So this is a new challenge. So one of the things that I wanted to start us off with was first mentioning who the World Health Organization is. But I mention this only because I'm going to be discussing the World Health Organization throughout my brief presentation. So who is who, right? The World Health Organization is an agency of the United Nations, and they are responsible for addressing international public health issues. They were established right after World War II in 1948. They are headquartered in Geneva, but they also have offices in New York and have many of their meetings. One of their international meetings is going to be happening just next week, but it's going to be virtual instead of in Geneva. So I wanted to begin the talk today by addressing what is or has the World Health Organization been doing about this fight regarding the infodemic. So the World Health Organization has done several different things. So one is in early February, even before this COVID-19 was addressed as a pandemic, they put out a situation report. And a situation report is just sort of a report where the World Health Organization tells you the basic new data, evidence, facts of a particular situation. So they addressed this in a situation report in early February about the rise in misinformation and the rise in sort of factually incorrect information that was being spread across social media and the internet. And so this was a important issue for them. And because of that, in February, they created a team of people who work for the World Health Organization to address the issues around misinformation. So one of the first things that they did was they worked with businesses. So they went primarily to businesses that are related, obviously, to social media and the internet. So they went to Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others. And one of the things they were able to do was to ask those businesses that when anybody was searching for coronavirus or searching for COVID-19, that they would immediately be directed to a reliable source. So they would be either directed to the World Health Organization, or in the United States, they would be directed to the CDC. And in other countries, they would be directed to their local health organization or a statewide health organization to get the most up-to-date and correct and factual information. The other thing that the World Health Organization did was they created web pages that are either called Mythbusters or they're called fact and fiction pages. And those you can find on the World Health Organization. And they try to address, again, the latest kind of misinformation that is being spread primarily on social media. They then also created what are called infographics or shareable images that people can share on social media themselves. And these, and you're going to see some of those in just a few moments. And those infographics the World Health Organization created were primarily to educate people, but especially to educate people around public health and trying to increase people's science literacy. Okay, so what have businesses done during the same time? So taking the lead from the World Health Organization, the major companies that are part of social media, again, and also search engines, got together and they issued a joint industry statement in early March where they said that they were going to address fraud and misinformation around the virus. And so different businesses have done different things. So what Facebook might be doing is going to be different than what, say, Reddit is doing and what Twitter is doing. I'll just give a couple of examples from Facebook. So Facebook, for example, now has a COVID-19 info center. And if you click on the COVID-19 info center, it should have the latest information about COVID-19. It's also going to be sharing information from the World Health Organization and also from CDC. They now have a section where you can fact check stuff there, and they also list false claims. So they are, when people are also posting things, if something is posted that is considered incorrect, underneath it will also have kind of a false claim and tell you what the correct information might be. The other thing that Facebook did was they offered kind of free, unlimited advertising to the World Health Organization. So then what are scientists and scholars doing to address this? So scientists and scholars are also working to address misinformation and the infodemic, and they're doing it in a different way than businesses or the World Health Organization. So one is there are a lot more scientists now who are writing kind of general audience articles or commentary that you can find in your local newspaper or in national newspapers. And again, primarily this is to increase kind of scientific literacy, public health literacy around this particular disease. The other thing that scientists and scholars are doing is that they're increasingly being interviewed by the media. I think almost every single night, if you watch the nightly news, you are going to see scientists or scholars being interviewed addressing different types of questions around COVID-19 or the coronavirus. The other thing that's happening is there's a lot more webinars that are out there right now, including this webinar, right? But there's a lot more webinars that are also trying to address kind of misinformation, trying to address spreading correct information about COVID-19. The other thing that's occurring right now is research. There is research being done kind of across North America related to addressing misinformation. So for example, recently in Canada, the country of Canada had given out $27 million in federal grants to address COVID-19. And those were from things such as trying to find a vaccination, all the way to addressing the infodemic or misinformation. And so they did give out a grant for $500,000 to a group of scientists and social scientists who were trying to figure out ways to educate people, but ways to figure out how and why misinformation is spread and ways to begin to address, especially in social media circles, how to address that misinformation. Okay, this week, one of the things that occurred was it was World Press Freedom Day, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, which is kind of a sister agency to the World Health Organization and is part of the United Nations. They did a week of educational programming, both as webinars, but also they put out a report, which I put the title up here, or the front of the report, which is Journalism, Freedom, Press Freedom and COVID-19, which you can get online through UNESCO. But they also created, again, a lot of infograms or memes that could be shared on social media. And they did this in multiple languages. They did it in the official languages of the United Nations. So you can go onto their webpage and find all of these different infograms that you can share yourself if you want to, that address misinformation and address also how to make sure that facts are being spread on social media and not just misinformation. So they have some great memes on there. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to share today was just a little bit about what types of misinformation is being spread on, again, primarily social media, but on the internet as well. And I would argue that it falls under three categories. One is the origins of COVID-19, which I'm not going to really talk about, but we can address maybe later in questions and answers. The deniers of COVID-19. And one of the things that the World Health Organization is really interested in addressing is misinformation around preventions, treatments, and cures of COVID-19. And so a lot of the information that they are sharing is addressed to the preventions, treatments, and cures part. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that in just a minute. Okay, so as Jennifer mentioned in the introduction, I work in the Environmental Studies Department at the University of Montana, where I'm an associate professor, but I'm also an ethnobotanist. And so I was trained as an ethnobotanist primarily in the traditional method, which was apprenticing with elder women. And but now I'm also an academic, so I also study ethnobotany from an academic point of view. But one of the things I am asked a lot about as an ethnobotanist is about medicinal plants. I get asked about medicinal plants pretty much everywhere I go, kind of at all times of the year. But one of the things that has happened since the coronavirus and COVID-19 is I have increasingly been asked about what types of plants or herbs can prevent or treat or cure COVID-19. And so one of the things I would say is none do. And the other question I get asked a lot is, sort of what plants can we use to boost or strengthen your immune system? And again, one of the things I share with people is that at this point, as far as we know, no one is immune to this because it is a new virus. And so it's something that people are doing research into. So there really is no kind of known plant or herb that you can use at this point to boost your immune system for COVID-19. But because of the questions that I've been asked as an ethnobotanist, and because of what I was seeing on social media, where I was seeing a lot of information being spread about herbal remedies or native plant remedies that could, again, kind of prevent, treat, or cure COVID-19, myself and a public health student who now, she's actually done, she finished her MPH, co-wrote an article on how herbal remedies are potentially dangerous to people who may be taking these as medication, hoping that they will either prevent, again, treat, or cure COVID-19. And this is how I became interested in thinking about addressing and reading a lot about sort of the misinformation that was occurring on social media around COVID-19. And I started, again, looking at especially what the World Health Organization was doing to address this. Okay, so the World Health Organization has created some great infographics or kind of information images that can be shared on social media. And one of the things that they're doing is they are sharing these on social media so that people can learn more about how to answer these questions for themselves, but then also how to answer these questions when it comes up, especially among family and friends. So I'm going to give you examples from 3 different categories that they have. And you can look these up if you want to, either on their Mythbusters page, or they also have a page called Fact and Fiction, which is primarily in Southeast Asia, but it's also in English and other languages. So one of the set of infographics that they have is related to answering questions around medicine or herbal remedies. And these are just some examples. And so, for example, one is, can you sort of eat garlic to prevent the infection of the new coronavirus? And so the way they answer it is garlic is healthy, but it's not going to prevent this current outbreak. Okay, and then another set of infographics that they have has to do with internal remedies. So this is different types of food that you might eat, different types, again, some herbal remedies, different types of things you may drink. So for example, there is, early on, there was sort of a rumor or misinformation that was spread that said that if you drank a lot of water, like if you just kept drinking water every few minutes, that you were going to flush the coronavirus or the COVID-19 out of your system, or it was going to protect you from that. And so this particular infographic that they're sharing says that there's no scientific evidence that proves that that is true, even though water is healthy for humans and you should be drinking water. And again, these ones in this particular page are from their Fact and Fiction page, which is part of their Southeast Asia section. So it does include things such as mango, which is one was new to me. That there was again, misinformation that eating mango because of the acids in the fruit was going to cure you from coronavirus. As the World Health Organization says, there is no scientific evidence that mango kills the new coronavirus. Then they also have infographics that discuss external remedies. So things that people do on the outside of their body, right, versus the inside of their body to try to either prevent, treat, or cure coronavirus. So some of these are kind of older, some of these are newer. So we have the extremes here, right? Should you be standing out in the cold to try to kill the coronavirus, or should you be out standing in the hot sun to kill the coronavirus? And in both cases, the answer to that is no. An earlier kind of misinformation that was shared was one that you should either spray the outside of your body or take a bath in like bleach or chlorine and it would kill the coronavirus. And it's not going to do that if you actually have the illness, if it's on the surface. So there's a difference, and I think we'll be talking about this a little bit more in the Q&A section, but there's a difference between sort of us having the virus on a surface versus externally and into your cell system. So there's clarification that can be made there, but in terms of sort of taking a bath in bleach or chlorine, no, that is not going to kill the coronavirus in a person. Okay, so I'm going to end with this slide before we go to Eric, and just say, kind of have us think about, why is misinformation bad? And why are organizations like the World Health Organization, which on one hand, right, should be addressing COVID-19 as a big public health issue and as a disease, but instead is also having to address all of this misinformation. And like I said earlier, they have a team of people that are working on this. But on the one hand, misinformation is bad because it is potentially dangerous for people, right? It's potentially dangerous for our own health, but it's also potentially dangerous for us as public, the entire public and our public health system. And the other thing that I think is important for us to remember is that misinformation is also, unfortunately, something that gets shared again on social media or the internet and it has it can take advantage of people who don't have access to public healthcare systems, don't have access to any healthcare, and they can potentially hurt themselves by doing some of these things that we are told are going to either prevent, cure, or treat COVID-19 when we know that they are not going to. This is something that we need to think about when we ourselves are reading something on social media and perhaps sharing something on social media, to really think about, wait, is that true? Does it really work? This is why we think that, or I think definitely that we need to think about how information matters and how we can start addressing this misinformation and addressing the infodemic that is currently happening here, not only in the US, but kind of across the world. So I'm going to end there. Thank you for listening. If you've got questions and comments, we will take those at the end, but now we're going to move on to Eric.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for that clear presentation about misinformation regarding the virus. I'm sure the audience will have more questions and will be excited to dive deeper into some of these areas when we get to the Q&A of the webinar. So let's turn to Professor Greene. Can you bring us full circle and remind us how misinformation about the virus relates to what we know about how viruses work?
Absolutely, I'll give it a go here. All right, can you see my screen? Great. Yeah, thanks, Rosalyn. On the first webinar, I gave a little bit of information about the basic natural history and biology of viruses and how viruses work in general, and what we know, a little bit about what we know about the coronavirus, COVID-19. And so I just want to return to some of the basic natural history of how viruses work, and specifically relate them to some of the things that Rosalyn has just told us about. And if you missed any of these webinars, I just want to remind you that you can go back and look on the Montana Natural History Center webpage, and the recordings of those are there. So for example, you could go back and listen to my full 25-minute little mini lecture on viruses. But I want to talk about two things. That I want to talk a little bit about water. And so one of the myths that is out there that Rosalyn talked about is that just drink plenty of water and it will flush the virus out of your body. And so I want to just go back again to the basic natural history of how viruses work, just to illustrate why this is a myth, why it's misinformation and it doesn't work. And so here again is the basic life cycle of a virus. So here's the coronavirus. Its first task is to get inside of our bodies, and specifically to get inside of our cells, infect cells, mainly cells in our lungs and respiratory tracts. And so that's what's happening here in this first cartoon, is the coronavirus is fooling our cells, fooling the cell membranes to get inside of our own cells. And the reason it's doing that is because the viruses do not have the biological machinery to make copies of their own genetic material. They're the ultimate parasites. And so what's happening in this third little cartoon is the virus particle, once it successfully got into one of our cells, it bursts, and the genetic material of the virus enters into our own cells, and it hijacks our own genetic replication machinery. And so our cells become hostages, become hijacked, and are turned into essentially giant or photocopy machines. So that's what's happening in this little fourth cartoon here, is our own genetic machinery is making millions of copies of the viral RNA in this case. And so it's pretty amazing that one virus particle getting into a cell when it turns our own cells into these photocopy machines, can crank out, you know, 1 million new virus particles. So one virus particle in one of our cells can crank out 1 million or so new virus particles. So the point I'm making here is that once a virus gets into the cells in our body, kind of the damage is done or is being done, and no amount of drinking water is going to flush these viruses out, right? The viruses are inside of our own cells, hijacking our machinery, our biochemical machinery, making copies of their own genes. And so no amount of drinking water is going to help this at all. It's important to, as Rosalyn mentioned, it's important to drink plenty of water and be hydrated, but it will do nothing to help flush out viruses. So it's complete biological nonsense. Now, I think most of you have heard more than once, it's important to wash our hands, especially with soap. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the biochemistry of why washing our hands with soap and water is really effective. So, you know, we're hearing stuff about bleach and sanitizers and so on and so forth, but it's really hard to beat as the first line of defense in good public health, washing our hands with soap and water often and washing them for 30 seconds or more. And here's the biochemical reason. So why does it work? So this is not a myth, okay? Washing our hands regularly with soap and water really does work. So this is not a myth. And here's why it works. So let me just remind you that this amazing little virus is only 14 genes. So it's just the bare amount of genetic material. It's just 14 genes wrapped basically in an oily bubble. Okay, so here in this cartoon, here's the genes. This is the genetic material. In this case, it's stored in the RNA molecule in coronaviruses. And here's this oily bubble. So this is the membrane, and it's 2 layers of lipids. And these are the little red things here. These are the corona or the crown spikes that are used by the virus to fool our own cells and gain entry into our own cells. But essentially, here's what we're going to think about, this little oily bubble. And here's a soap molecule. Soap molecules are biochemically incredibly interesting. They've got a long tail that's made of a lipid, and then they've got a head that likes water. So oil doesn't like water, so oil and water don't mix, but a soap molecule has 2 really different properties. One, the tail end of it loves oil and attaches to oily things. This other end loves water and attaches to water. Okay, so it's a very interesting molecule. And the reason we use soap, for example, if you want to get grease out of your clothes or off your hands, the reason soap works so well is because the oily tail part of the soap molecule, like attracts like, so this tail attaches to the grease, and then this part of the molecule, the soap molecule that likes water, attaches to water, and the water helps pull the oily part, the greasy part off. Okay, so this is how soap works. It's why it's so effective at getting grease and oil and stuff out of our clothes. So what happens when we wash our hands? Well, here's what happens with the viruses in particular. Recall that we've got these 14 genes wrapped in basically an oily bubble. So the soap molecules are able to get in there, and the part of the soap molecules that are called hydrophobic, they don't like water, but they like the oily substances. So those can get in there and attach to the oily parts of the membrane of the virus. Okay, and so they can really disrupt it. And then the water that we're washing our hands with can attach to these parts of the soap molecule and basically dissolve, burst apart the virus. Okay, so this is a little bit of the biochemistry of why washing our hands with soap and water really does work. It's not a myth, and it's effective because the way soap interacts with this oily membrane that surrounds the virus. It basically dissolves it, disrupts it, and then here we've got these little cartoons, the little bits and pieces of the virus are kind of being surrounded by the soap molecules and so forth. So this is a little bit about the biochemistry, about why washing our hands with soap and water is effective and does work. And here's just some photos that have been making the rounds. You might have seen them, but this is just, I just want to make the point that, again, washing our hands with soap and water does work. So this is showing bacteria, not viruses, but same idea. Bacteria are surrounded by membranes of lipids. So their cell membranes are basically similar to the outer membranes of viruses. They're oily membranes. And so here are some pictures taken with under UV light of a woman's hands. And wherever you see this purple glow, it's, so the bacteria were dyed with a dye that glows with UV light. And so here you can see that this woman's hands, she's got a lot of bacteria on her hands, right? And so the bottom panel shows her hands after, let's look at the lower left here. Here she washed her hands for 6 seconds with soap and water. And so if you can compare her hands here to here, you can see that a lot of the bacteria are gone after just 6 seconds, right? Especially on the bigger parts, but there's still a lot of bacteria, you know, between her fingers and other places. Here's after 15 seconds. Here's after 30 seconds of washing her hands with soap and water. So that's kind of where we hear wash your hands for at least 20 seconds, 30 seconds with soap and water. So you can see that after 30 seconds with soap and water, you know, most of the bacteria have been sort of disrupted, dissolved, and washed away mechanically by the water. So if you want to be really safe, wash your hands with soap and water for a minute. And if we had images of what viruses look like before and after washing, it would be quite similar. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of briefly tie back some of the things Rosalyn has been talking about, and specifically talk about why washing with soap and water is so effective when it comes to viruses. And so that's the end of my little spiel. And I think now we're going to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Greene. So you're right. It is now time to open it up to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask us a question, you can use the question and answer feature, the Q&A through Zoom, or the chat box to ask a question to our panelists. If your question is accepted, we will share it with our panel. As a reminder, we are not medical doctors and will not take questions to diagnose any symptoms related to COVID-19. So I do have a question here to start us off. We had someone actually make a comment during Rosalyn's presentation. I'm going to read that out loud. I also saw an emerging research article about a scientist in Alberta who thinks THC or CBD has cure potential. I have to think about who may be paying for that. So when I was reading that, I thought that they made an interesting point, and it leads us to ask, I think, a bigger question. When looking at research articles that are coming out about COVID-19, how can we investigate how they're funded to determine credibility, or just determining credibility in general from this information?
Should any of us jump in there?
Go for it. If someone has an answer, please.
So, I mean, I guess what most people do, you know, what most scholars do is you can, again, you know, sort of look at who published the article. Is it a general audience article? So say, is it, you know, the New York Times or the Washington Post reporting that an article was published? Usually in a scientific journal article, it is going to list who the authors are. It's going to list the institutions that they come from, and it's going to list all of the funding sources that were part of that research. So you can find out if it's, for example, the National Science Foundation or the NIH, National Institutes of Health. So you get a sense of who funded that particular article. There's also industry that does scientific research, and they also publish articles. And so you can go to an industry website and find articles or basic information from those particular companies that have done research on particular, whether it is illness or whether it is sort of, in my field, kind of plant research. So it's always important to first, yes, find out who's funding it, but that doesn't necessarily mean even who's funding it, whether it is kind of good or bad science, but that's helpful to know. And then who's publishing it. And you can, as long as you can contact the authors and email them and find out more information. But I would always go back to the original scientific journal article and try to read that, and not necessarily the general audience article that's attempting to describe what is in the scientific journal article. Because sometimes there can be, sometimes a general audience article may oversimplify or even imply something that is not necessarily in the actual scientific journal article, or what those scientists are attempting to report on. So I'll say that.
Great, thanks for shedding some more light on that. Knowing how to figure out whether what we're reading that looks like it's coming from a scientist is credible is really important. And I think that most people probably don't read the fine print. So it's even more important to do so for information regarding COVID. Would Dr. Greene or Dr. Lewis like to comment on that?
Yeah, I can say a few things.
Sure.
This is actually a really tricky time, in that a lot of the stuff that's being reported, even if it's coming from scientists and credible research sources, it hasn't gone through the peer review process yet. So it hasn't gone through the full round of every scientist in the same field viewing that and saying, yes, this is good science, we can trust their conclusions. Because people are just trying to get their information out as quick as possible so that it can be potentially used. But it becomes really tricky, even for scientists right now, to try to pick through all the stuff that's happening. There's a lot of research going on out there, and we have to, as scientists, realize that a lot of this stuff isn't actually published yet in scientific journals. It hasn't gone through that full process yet. And so we need to be kind of extra careful as we're reading and trying to pick through and keep our messaging kind of more succinct and less confusing, to where it's a super tricky time right now. But so that's one thing that I do want the audience out there to notice is, when you're getting information, can you actually find, is it published? Or is it just something that somebody said to a journalist? Or is it something that's on what we call a preprint server, meaning they've written up a paper and they've shown their methods, but it hasn't actually gone through the review process yet? Because I'm seeing a lot of stuff that's treated as if it has gone through that process, whereas it hasn't. So it's really tricky.
I'll just jump in and say one more thing. Yeah, it's a confusing time because there's so much information out there, but I'll just go back to one thing that Rosalyn started her talk with, is that I would say, look to organizations like the World Health Organization, our Center for Disease Control, our county public health. I mean, these people are sort of filters. They're some of the best and brightest epidemiologists, virus scientists, medical doctors, public health people. And this is their life. And so they're kind of a filter, but I would trust information that's coming out of those organizations right now, more than stuff that's floating around more generally, perhaps. So you know, what Rosalyn started with, talking about World Health Organization and CDC and others, you can be pretty sure that the information they're posting is really solid.
Great, thanks for adding on to that. Okay, so we have a question next. We actually have a few questions all circling around the idea of RNA markers. So our next question here, should there be RNA markers if this was a virus made in a lab? And I know that the fact that whether or not the virus was made in the lab is in itself, might be misinformation. So can we speak to that a little bit about some of that misinformation that's circling around about the possibility of this virus maybe being made in a lab or not being made in a lab, and how that jump again works from animals to humans, and what evidence exists to tell us where the truth lies in that?
It's all you, Angie.
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. So yeah, so that's going, there's a lot of stuff floating around about how maybe this thing came from a lab. But I would say that there actually, this is one area where there actually has been a few papers published. They've gone through that full review process where other scientists have verified it and agreed with it and let it come out in a scientific publication, that there is absolutely no evidence of it coming from a lab. And there are a few markers which you might expect to see maybe if it came from a particular type of lab, and they're not seeing that. Whereas they are seeing that it is very closely related to something that we have seen in bats. And so there's very good evidence that at some point this came from a bat reservoir host. And there may have been an intermediate host that it jumped into first before it got to humans, but it's very closely related to things that we have seen in bats and we've actually known about for several years. And so I would say all of the evidence at this point it definitely points to it coming straight from a bat or through an intermediate host and not coming from a lab. And
I'll also jump in and say that this whole class of coronaviruses, they're well known for, they do really, really well in bats, and some of the previous outbreaks of viral epidemics have clearly come from bats jumping into other hosts and then into people. So it's not a surprise that this one came from a bat, right? But yeah.
Great, thanks for talking more about that. I feel like personally, I've been seeing a lot of things on social media and just on different networks about whether or not this actually did come from a lab or whether this came straight from an animal in the wet markets, as we talked about during our first episode. So it's great to get some more of that expert commentary back from our team. Okay, we have another question here about the RNA part of the virus here that I want to clarify for our audience. So it says the virus is an RNA virus, right? It's happy in our bodies apparently. Would you expect it to evolve and become either more or less virulent? Since I believe RNA viruses change frequently. Angie, can you speak to this, or Dr. Greene?
Well, maybe I'll start and then pass it off to Angie. So yeah, so that's a really good point. And it really gets down to the $64 million question right now. We don't know how this thing might change over the next few months or years or so, but there's 6 major kind of classes of viruses, and they're classified mainly on how they store their genetic material. So there's some DNA viruses, and coronaviruses are RNA viruses. And as a class, this group of viruses has some of the highest mutation rates of any of the viruses. Viruses in general have high mutation rates, so they're changing often, which is why we need a different vaccine every year for influenza, because the influenza virus is changing every year. But the coronaviruses will probably mutate even more rapidly than influenza viruses. And so this is a really, really important question, and one that scientists are trying to deal with right now. But there is evidence that even since the start of this thing, say in that there was an important new mutation in this virus just since like in February or March or something, and it has swept and superseded the first type of virus that was getting around. So, and Angie can speak more to it, but already in this cycle right now, there's already been one important mutation that has been more virulent and, I guess, infectious than the first version. So this is an open question that people are working on intensely right now. So Angie, you can pick it up.
Yeah, so like Eric said, these viruses do mutate very quickly. But the question is, what does that mean? Like all viruses are constantly mutating. And so is it necessarily a bad thing? Does it necessarily mean that it's going to be worse for us as it does that? And the answer is no, it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be worse for us as it does that. It's a problem for flu in particular. We worry about that because we need to vaccinate every year or two in order for it to really be effective, because it changes enough to where our immune system doesn't recognize it anymore. But most of the time, it's not changing in virulence all that much. It's not becoming more deadly to us. We do occasionally see really deadly strains, but often that's because a big shift has happened. And flu is a bit different in that it can change rapidly. It can change a lot rapidly because it also goes through recombination in a way that a lot of other viruses don't do. But with coronavirus, yes, we would expect it to change over time. That's what happens with these types of viruses. And we have seen changes in the strains that we're seeing over time. But the question is, are they becoming more deadly? Is it actually better for the virus to become more deadly? A lot of times it's not. And so we really need to be thinking about, like, from the virus's perspective, it wants to, or the strains that do well are the ones that get transmitted really easily. And sometimes that actually means having less symptoms. That means causing less disease because the people are healthy and walking around, and it's more easy for it to get from person to person if you're not feeling really bad and stuck in bed. And so when we're thinking about the evolution of virulence, we have to really think about how is this thing transmitted? How does it go from person to person? And how does that correlate to the symptoms that you see and the mortality rate? And often what you see is there's this trade-off between how deadly it is and then how good it is at actually infecting others. So from a virus's perspective, it wants to cause some symptoms because it wants to get transmitted, because sometimes those coughs can help it get from person to person. And they also correlate with how much virus is actually being replicated within the body. If the virus is replicating really fast, that means there's lots of virus in there, and you're going to have a greater chance of spread, but only if you come into contact with people. And so if you have a lot of virus in you, often that means that you've killed a lot of cells and you have more symptoms. So there's this kind of push and pull that's constantly happening. We call it like an evolutionary arms race between a host and a virus on, like, kind of where is that optimal level of virulence, or how deadly should it be? And so it's really hard. So the virus is doing a great job right now of getting transmitted. And so it probably isn't going to change drastically. It is not going to become much more deadly probably over the next year or two before we have a good vaccine. Is it going to change a bit? Yeah, potentially. But there's this constant trade-off. I don't particularly see it being a huge change that will happen over the next few years.
Thank you. And to lead into that, we just got another question in that I think highlights that as well for what we're going to be talking about in next week's webinar. So if the virus is mutating even slightly, maybe not becoming more deadly, but changing, the vaccine that they're working on right now, if it's ready, say in 18 months, how will that work for the current mutation that we're potentially seeing?
Yeah, that is a really great question. And we're going to have a great vaccine specialist, Dr. Jay Evans, who is going to join our webinar next time. And I think that would be a really great question for him to answer.
I agree too. We can save that one for Dr. Evans next week. Great. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask a question that's a bit more centered around COVID-19 and cybersecurity. This actually is coming from the executive director of the Montana Natural History Center himself. He's tuning in today as well. And so just kind of some background here. Some of the misinformation that's been going on a lot and been rampant is the world of cybersecurity and cybercrime surrounding COVID-19. The Montana Natural History Center has actually had several spear phishing attempts recently, and they're targeted scams where a cyber criminal poses as someone working with an organization with the aim of to infiltrate your organization through email or other means. And because many organizations and businesses are largely now working remotely, especially thinking about health organizations and their cybersecurity, they're using this practice to their advantage to try and steal money or data or information from people. So I was just curious about how this relates to COVID-19 and where the misinformation and the information is hitting with how people are getting that information and why that's advantageous to these folks.
I'll start answering that question, but I would also say go back to the World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization actually does have a page on this because it has become such an issue, not only in the United States, but worldwide. So they do have a page on sort of the cybersecurity question, but so do other, as Dr. Greene had mentioned before, if you go to these national or worldwide organizations that have already done the research or have sort of the worldwide experts working for them, they have tried to address some of these questions and tried to answer some of these questions. And they may already have some of this information on their websites. So those are always a good place to begin.
Great, thank you for sharing some of that.
And I guess I'd just say that, yeah, we all have to be careful. I get so many emails and even phone calls a day that are clearly scams. And I guess just general advice is just don't give any info or open stuff from people that you don't know and some of this stuff looks incredibly, it looks real and it looks professional, but yeah, it's just, we have to be on extra high alert.
Definitely, thank you. Okay, we have a comment here in the chat box and then I'm gonna slide over to another question. I think Dr. Greene, you actually mentioned this book in a previous webinar, Spillover. Was that one that you mentioned? We just had a comment from oh, you're bringing it right up. Nice. We had a comment here in our chat box that say David Quammen's book from 2012 is terrific and extremely pertinent to this civic experience. Dr. Greene, do you want to remind us a little bit about what this book?
Yeah, David Quammen is a great Montana author. He lives in Bozeman, and he wrote this book actually 8 years ago, and it's all about viral diseases or infections that are in animals that can jump over to people, and hence the name of the book, Spillover. But it's a very prescient book. It basically, he traveled all around the world visiting leading wildlife biologists, epidemiologists, medical doctors, and basically predicts, hey, wake up folks, we're gonna have a pandemic. It will probably be a coronavirus. We're really unprepared. It's gonna crash the economy, and there's another book that we highlighted on the first webinar. These might be backwards, but The Viral Storm by Nathan Wolfe, who is a leading virologist who, again, goes around the world and helps track emerging infectious diseases, mainly viral diseases. So those two books are highlighted and they're both great reads. David Quammen in yesterday's New Yorker magazine has a great article on this stuff too. So yeah, good points, and stuff by David Quammen is very interesting, and he's in our local author shed.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're really close to the end here, but there is one last question I want to try and squeeze in. If it can have a brief answer, we'll find out. We have one other question here in the chat box that says about coming back to COVID-19 spreading from the eating of bats. So just to clarify with our team, is it possible that it was spread from the eating of the bat, or from being near the bat, or breathing in the bat? How exactly did that transmission, do we suggest or assume maybe that could have taken place?
Yeah, we don't really know for sure exactly what happened to spill over from a bat to a human. And some of the other diseases that we've seen, like SARS, for example, we know it went from bat and it jumped into civet cats, and then civet cats into humans. And we've seen an intermediate host being necessary for a couple of other diseases as well, like Nipah virus jumps from bats to pigs to humans in some instances. And so we're not sure if there was an intermediate host involved, or if there was a direct spillover from a bat into a human. It likely didn't come actually from eating, because typically you don't really get the virus in this way. If your food is cooked, then you've killed the virus, and then it's not infectious anymore. It's possible that, but there are places in Asia where they do eat bats, and actually in Africa too. There's some really large fruit bats that actually provide a decent meal, and so bats are eaten in a lot of parts of the world. And so it could have happened through a process of killing the bat and slaughtering the bat, and dealing with the blood of the bat. That could have led to the transmission to humans, but the actual eating process of somebody else that just bought a cooked bat, it's very unlikely that led to the transmission.
Great, thank you so much. I didn't know that either, so I was super curious myself. Thank you. Okay, well, we have reached our time, so I'm going to stop it here, and thank you to all of our viewers today. We had some great questions and have thoroughly enjoyed this webinar series with everyone so far. We will be holding one more session actually next week, and Dr. Lewis mentioned this before, but we have a virologist that will be joining us next week, Dr. Jay Evans, who is currently working on the vaccine for the COVID-19 program. So we have a very special guest, very special scientist joining us next week, who will be doing a short presentation and then doing an interview style presentation next week, where we'll be asking the scientist about the vaccine, going back and forth with our panelists. If you'd like to keep in touch and receive more information about next week's webinar or any potential future webinars, please email jrobinson@montananaturalist.org. We'll throw that in the chat box for you if you're not already on our email list, and we'll get you added to that list for those future updates. A recording of this webinar and the previous week's webinars will be available on the Montana Natural History Center website. Our co-host, Drew Lefebvre, will add the link to the chat box if any of you would like to access those recordings. Thank you to all of our panelists today, the Montana Natural History Center and the University of Montana, for this partnership in our new webinar series, The Age of the Coronapocene. We will see you all again next Friday at 3 p.m. for our fifth episode about the science behind the vaccine of COVID-19. Have a safe and fun, socially distanced weekend, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Wash your hands with soap and water.